Welcome to Everything Co-op, bringing you information on how cooperatives can help improve your quality of life. This show is being sponsored by the National Co-op Bank, NCB. The NCB is dedicated to strengthening communities nationwide for the delivery of banking and financial services for the nation's cooperatives, their members, and other socially responsible organizations. For more information on the power of community ownership, visit ncb.coop. That's ncb.coop. Now stay tuned for your host, Vernon Oakes.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Everything Co-op, where we explore how the cooperative business model can improve the economic well-being of people and communities. I'm your host, Vernon Oakes. Our guest today is someone many of our long-term listeners will recognize. Steve Dubb has been on Everything Co-op before, and we're delighted to welcome him back. Steve is the Strategic Initiatives Editor at Shelterforce, an independent nonprofit newsroom that has spent more than 50 years reporting on affordable housing, community development, housing justice, and equitable economic development. Before joining Shelterforce, Steve served as Senior Editor of Economic Justice at Nonprofit Quarterly and previously worked at the Democracy Collaborative, where he helped advance the field of community development, wealth building. Early in his career, he served as Executive Director of NASCO, the North American Students of Cooperation, supporting housing cooperatives and developing cooperative leaders throughout the U.S. and Canada. Steve has authored and edited numerous books on democratic ownership, economic justice, and community wealth. Most recently, he co-edited Invisible No More, Voices from Native America, highlighting indigenous perspectives on economic and community development. Steve, welcome back to Everything Co-op. It's always a pleasure to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
So let's get started with first questions. Americans hear every day that we have a housing crisis. From your perspective, what are the root causes of that crisis, and why has it become so difficult to solve?
Yeah, thanks, Vern. So a few responses. One, there are tens of millions of Americans who struggle to afford housing every day. They don't just hear that they have a housing crisis, they live it. And the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies documents this every year. They just had a report out for 2025, which is their 2026 report. And we're talking about tens of millions of American families that struggle to afford housing. That means they spend 30% of their income, sometimes as much as 50% or even greater than that. So above 30% is considered cost burden. Above 50% is considered extremely cost burden. And those numbers have been going up year by year. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that is a local market. So the housing situation in Detroit is not the same as the housing situation in Washington, D.C., is not the same as in Boston, where I live, et cetera, et cetera. So housing is a local phenomenon, and we probably should more accurately talk about housing crises, plural, rather than a housing crisis. What's driving it and why is it difficult? The biggest driver is economic inequality. So we act as if it's a question of housing supply. In some cases, it may be a question of housing supply. But honestly, there was a study that came out. It was published. One of the authors was from the San Francisco Federal Reserve. We ran a story on it at Shelterforce earlier this year. And what it showed was that if you tracked mean income, average income in dollar amounts, and housing prices, they track about 1-to-1. In other words, compared to mean income, the cost of housing has not gone up. On the other hand, if you track it according to median income, in other words, the income that's earned by the average family, 50% greater, 50% less, well, that has become much, much, much more unaffordable. So the problem with affording housing has to do with the fact that incomes are not keeping up, not so much about housing supply specifically. So without solving for income inequality, it's going to be difficult to solve for housing. And the study that was cited, said if they implemented every housing measure you can imagine in San Francisco, after decades you might finally get to some kind of equilibrium, or you could do something with address income inequality. The other thing I think it's important to understand is the nature of housing in the United States. So we've made housing, particularly home ownership, sort of this sacred thing. And we've made it the primary, quote unquote, wealth building strategy of middle class Americans, for lack of a better phrase. And what does that mean? It means anytime somebody is buying a house, they're actually buying two different things at once. They're buying a place to live, and they're buying an investment product, right? You want that house value to go up, so you build wealth. This has pernicious effects in a couple of ways. One, you're buying two things instead of one, so that's more expensive. So that alone leads to greater strain on income. Secondly, you create a built-in political base that wants the price of housing to stay expensive. Because guess what? If the price of housing comes down, which it has at certain times, such as after the Great Recession, then people lose that wealth. And people who already own a house have a vested interest often in keeping prices elevated. So those kinds of structural issues make the housing crisis more difficult to resolve.
Wow, that's a lot to unfold. That's extremely interesting. And I've been in housing most of my career, and as a property manager, it was always that question. You didn't want to rent to somebody whose household income, that the housing was 30% or higher than the household income. And to break that down a little bit, if there's a family, two people making $27,000 each, that's a $54,000 total housing income. At 30%, they can pay no more than $1,350 a month. But that's the total cost of housing, not just the rent or the mortgage. Okay, I normally would say 30% just for the rent. If they can afford 30% of their income, or if they have 30% of their income, which equal to or more than the rent, then they could come in. If they got to be 50%, and that says the same two people working, but both working full time and making right above what one calls poverty, then they'd be paying $2,100 a month. That's before taxes. That's gross on gross income, and that gets to be a heavy burden on somebody whose household is $54,000 a year. In D.C., it's hard to find a home for $2,100 a month these days, and at somebody at $54,000 couldn't make it. Okay, you'd have to be a lot more than that to be able to afford that housing. Okay.
Yep.
Now, I'd never thought about that two things you're buying, though. You're buying a place to lay down that calls security, and kids can do homework and all of those things that a house brings, that safety. But you're also buying an investment vehicle, and so you're always wanting it to improve. I've always wanted that. You want the house prices to go up. So everybody that owns a home is pushing for the house pricing to go up, and there's this drive to keep it moving. Okay. Yeah, that keeps the prices up.
Yeah, you can see how that creates a disincentive for affordability, right?
Yeah. So you've spent much of your career writing about community wealth building. What does that term mean, and why do you believe it offers a better framework for strengthening communities?
Yeah, so I talk about it as more I have a column called Solidarity Corner, so I talk about it more in terms of solidarity economy. But the idea in either case is around having greater community ownership of economic production, so that the economy, the ownership of the economy, is held by communities themselves rather than by external capitalists, let's put it that way, large corporations. So we've had, part of, I mentioned the economic inequality being a driver of housing shortages and housing crisis, right? Particularly for people with lower incomes. Well, part of the reason that is occurring is because the wealth production capacity of communities often gets extracted from them. And, if you look at the value on Wall Street, the economy is going gangbusters, right? But for ordinary Americans, it is not going gangbusters. And so there's so the idea behind a solidarity economy or community wealth building is to reorient ownership of the economy away from large multinational firms and toward community-based enterprises that can generate wealth and recycle that wealth by spending, salaries, procurement, et cetera, within the community. If you can do that, you can start building a more equitable economy.
So I've been trying to understand the term economy, and I have it that it started with the flow of money in a home, at the local house level. How does money flow in and out? And what I've just heard you say, which I've also said a lot on this program, is that in too many communities, money from that community flows out, is extracted by the cooperative. And I lived it in West Virginia where I grew up. My grandfather worked on the mines and my father worked on the railroad. That means there was large corporations coming in, taking the coal out of the mountains and the timber and taking it away, and they took that profit away too. It didn't stay. Matter of fact, there was this conflict all the time between labor and owners of who got that capital, who got that wealth. And the laborers got it in terms of salaries, and the owners try to keep that salary as low as possible. So there was always that tension. But the extraction is what happens, and how do you get the money to stay in the community, in those homes? That more money that comes in stays in the home, stays in the community. And that's community wealth building, or solidarity economy. How do you end up getting that? Do I have that in agreement with what you think?
I think that's right. So, solidarity economy is based on values of solidarity, democracy, equity, sustainability, and pluralism. So it's not about and community wealth building has similar principles. It's not about creating a cookie cutter model that's going to solve all problems for all time. I think we've learned enough about the economy over the centuries to know that doesn't actually work that way. There has to be flexibility as well as a focus on values and principles. And you're right. Economy. The meaning of the word economy comes from oikos and nomos, which is management of home. Those are the Greek words for management of home, right? So an economy is management of our planetary home, if you will. And, so there are lots of technical things that can be done. I'll give you one just to try to be there are sort of things you can do in terms of procurement, government contracting, but for example, there's a lot of people who own businesses who will be retiring, and you can structure the purchase of those businesses to be owned by the workers through, whether it's through a trust as an employee stock ownership plan company, or through direct shares like a worker cooperative. So there are strategies that could be done with existing businesses as owners exit to share ownership. So that's one technical thing. Obviously, there's the need for certain laws. Price discrimination is just one thing I'll mention really quickly. If you go on an airplane today, you'll notice that pretty much every person on each seat is paying a different price. That used to be illegal. It technically still is. They get away with it by saying that the terms of carriage for each person is slightly different. Well, you bought this with, the intention to return on X day, et cetera. So starting to shift the laws to ensure fair competition can make a lot of difference. And there was some effort in the early 2020s under Lena Khan when she was at I think it was Federal Trade Commission. I got my government agencies right, to enforce antitrust, which hadn't really been enforced in the last 40 years in the U.S. So there are certain mechanisms. Ultimately, there's a need to move to an economy that is not based on private extraction of income and wealth, which is the capitalist system we have now, to a system based on principles of solidarity, democracy, equity, sustainability, and pluralism, which is what the idea of a solidarity economy is. That is not going to be easy. It's not going to necessarily be quick. But there are things that can be done, things that are being done in different communities across the United States and of course, across the world.
So you've talked a lot here and out there in the world about ownership, and it matters. So why is creating owners, not just employees or consumers, so important for reducing inequality and building lasting prosperity?
Yeah, the shortest answer I can give to that is because most wealth goes to the owners of enterprises, of businesses. So what do I mean by that? Well, there was a study that was released earlier this year by two economists, Gabriel Zuckman and Emmanuel Saez, and they showed that 20 people had the wealth that was equivalent of 12% of U.S. gross domestic product. So this is your Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, et cetera, right? They own, their wealth alone is 12% of the entire year's economic production of the United States. That's 4 times the wealth that was owned, which was about 3% gross domestic product at the time, by the robber barons at the end of the 19th century. We're talking about folks like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, et cetera, right? So the level of economic inequality is, I think most people understand that it's bad in the United States today. It's far worse than is popularly understood. This is historically unprecedented level of economic inequality. And it's driving our politics. Some people think that this orange guy is in charge of the U.S. government, but it's actually more the folks I just named: Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Tim Cook, folks like that, that control. This is why when Bernie Sanders, for example, talks about the United States having become an oligarchy, he's absolutely correct. That is, in fact, what we have become. And until we solve this, not only can we not solve the housing crisis, we can't deal with other issues, economic production. So yes, changing that situation so that the ownership of the economy is not such that 20 individuals can own 12% of the wealth of the United States is in fact imperative.
So I've heard that stat a little differently. It's sort of 1%, the top 1% of wealth has more wealth, and it may just be these 20 people, than the bottom 50% of Americans.
Yes, that is true as well.
Yeah.
But at the very top, it's extremely extreme. So both are problems, right? And both are historically impressive amounts. When I was growing up, this isn't a wealth figure, it's an income figure, but I just want to give you, in the 70s when I was growing up, the top 1% earned about 8% of income in the United States. And now it's closer to 20%. That's a huge, huge difference. And it means on the other end, if you're in the bottom 99%, or perhaps more specifically bottom 90% or what have you, you become more and more squeezed. So people who are the top 10% are probably still generally pretty well off, right? Even if they don't have the wealth of the very top. But there's a lot of people who are struggling to make it go by, make it by. Effectively, what used to be a somewhat, I don't want to exaggerate it because the economy in the United States has never been particularly equitable, but more equitable economy where folks were less stressed about making ends meet. That has shifted. Now you have 40-50% of the population who are living literally paycheck to paycheck. And that's a very unstable situation to be in. We've seen the effects of this. Vernon, you live in Washington, D.C. You saw the effects when there was a shutdown. Mm-hmm. Government workers who are generally upper middle class, right? By at least, I'm using middle class loosely here to mean, above median income. But have decent incomes. When they had 2 or 3 paychecks that they missed, they were having to take out loans. Didn't used to be the case as much. And it speaks to the level of stress that our economy is under for ordinary people.
So, Steve, when I grew up in the 60s, one of the goals was to get a good government job because it had good income and had benefits and is relatively safe from upturns and downturns. So many Americans have not heard of housing co-ops. If they've listened to this program, they've heard of them. But what are they and how do they differ from apartments or condos?
Yeah, so, in one sense, housing co-ops were the first form of housing condominiums. This is why New York City has so many housing co-ops, because condos didn't exist then. And the only way you could have ownership within an apartment building was through a housing co-op. So I won't get into the technical stuff because we could spend a lot of time explaining the differences.
Yes.
But effectively, a housing co-op owns the entire structure. Now, the structure may be a single building, it might be a set of townhomes, whatever the actual property is. And they are governed like any other co-op on the principle of one member, one vote. So even if one person has a more valuable investment than another person, everybody's vote is equal. And they own a board, they vote for a board, and the board manages the cooperative on behalf of everyone. There are then various different forms of housing co-ops. Really briefly, there are market rate housing co-ops. I actually lived in a market rate housing co-op in DC for a number of years called the Eastmont Cooperative. I'll put a shout out to them on Eastern Avenue Northwest.
And I live in one now, Steve, East Capitol Gardens on East Capitol and Benny Road. It's a market rate co-op.
Yeah. And then there are limited equity co-ops where most of the equity stays within the cooperative and there's small shares that are owned by the individuals. And there are zero equity co-ops, they're sometimes called group equity co-ops. You mentioned NASCO at the beginning. The student housing cooperatives are an example of a zero equity or group equity co-op where the entire equity of the cooperative stays within the organization and members have rights to vote for the board of directors and control the organization, but don't have an equity draw.
So you've written about community land trusts, resident ownership, and tenant opportunity to purchase programs. How do these approaches complement housing co-ops, and what lessons can communities learn from them?
Well, Tenant Opportunity Purchase Act in DC, the housing co-op I lived in wouldn't exist but for the TOPA law in DC that allowed the tenants to buy it. So Tenant Opportunity Purchase is a tool that can be used to create cooperatives. Community land trusts are different. There can be housing cooperatives on community land trust land. Essentially, community land trust means that the land itself is owned by a nonprofit entity, usually with a mix of resident and non-resident board members, and owns the land in perpetuity. So it's a tool for preserving permanent affordability. Resident ownership, just to be clear, what we're talking about typically, all housing co-ops are a form of resident ownership, but what we're talking about are ROCs, resident communities. These are manufactured housing communities that are where the land is owned by the residents. And, something to know about mobile homes is that they're not mobile. But there are 18 million American families, something like that. It's a huge number. It is the single largest source of naturally occurring, not through any government program, affordable housing in the United States. And a lot of these mobile home communities where they're not really mobile, there's private equity owners that are, speaking of outside extraction, who are buying up these properties. And there are laws in many states and perhaps district, I'm not sure, that give residents notice and the opportunity to buy the property anytime it comes up for sale. And so that's a way of securing land tenure for these manufactured housing home residents, who again number the tens of millions across the United States.
Thank you, Steve.
There are hundreds of cooperatives, so it's actually fairly large. Yeah.
We're going to take our first and only break here in a second or two. We talked about housing co-ops and community land trusts, and we're going to get more into, when we come back, building community wealth and leadership looking toward the future. So, Steve, I always enjoy and always learn from you, so I'm looking forward to the second half. Please don't touch that dial. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. This is Vernon Oakes. Steve Dubb is our guest today. And I've been, as I said before the break, enjoying our conversation because I continue to learn. So, Steve, if you were advising cities facing rising housing costs today, what combination of cooperatives and community ownership strategies would you recommend first?
Yeah, so I don't know if there's a specific answer I can give to that question. I think the most important thing is to have a social housing strategy, and that usually involves a combination of public ownership, like public housing, cooperative. We haven't talked about that, but it's a very important form of housing. Cooperative and community ownership strategies. So the key thing is that there needs to be, what I talked at the beginning about how housing creates this dual purpose of housing for living and housing for investment. So if you can separate some of that through when you think about these community ownership strategies, these public ownership strategies, they're a way of separating those two things and just providing housing, a place to live. And if you do that, you reduce the cost, you preserve affordability, and you reduce market pressures on people who are trying to form housing. So that's, I think, the most important thing I can advise in terms of communities. But there's, you have to do the study for your own community, and it'd be foolish to say there's a specific formula. There are places like Singapore and Vienna that are often cited as places that have very successful social housing strategies internationally. But, every community has to sort of come up with its own solution. The important principle, again, is to build a strong social housing sector that's not subject to the whims of the housing market.
The whims of capitalism.
Exactly.
Okay. So you've written about the solidarity economy, and we talked about it a little bit. And you talked a little bit about how it differs from capitalism. Where the cooperatives fit within this broader vision of solidarity economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think cooperatives are a form of ownership, so there are different types of cooperatives. We haven't really talked about that. Maybe you have with other guests, I imagine. But, so there are worker cooperatives. We talked a little bit about those. There are also consumer cooperatives. Credit unions are a common example of those, as is our most local food co-ops. There are producer co-ops like particularly in farming, purchasing co-ops like Ace Hardware. So the idea with all these cooperative strategies is that you share ownership of the economy and of productive capacity among many owners. So cooperatives are a form of doing that. A solidarity economy is focused on shifting ownership to ordinary people. So cooperatives are a form, potentially, of enacting solidarity economy principles in practice. Is every co-op that operates now thinking in these terms? Absolutely not. But could they be? They could be. And, I know not that long ago you had, I think you had Michael Peck on and some other folks who were talking about the social economy. So there are communities in places like Spain, in Italy, in Quebec, in Canada, elsewhere in the world, in Japan, Korea, where you are seeing larger shares of the economy being run cooperatively. And that has very positive effects in terms of sharing ownership of the means of producing products and services, and of sharing the wealth that's generated from that.
So, besides solidarity economy and housing, you've also written about public banking. And first question is, does that include credit unions in public banking? And what role? Go ahead.
Keep going. No, go ahead.
What roles do banks play in financing affordable housing, cooperative business, and local economic development?
Let me explain what a public bank is.
Okay.
So a public bank provides financing to banks and credit unions. It is not itself a bank or a credit union, actually, even though it has bank in its name. So the Bank of North Dakota, which has been around since 1919, I mean, it is a bank, but it's not, you can't go to the bank teller window at the Bank of North Dakota, open your personal bank account. That's not how it works. They have like a special program for student loans to reduce the cost of the interest for the students in North Dakota on their borrowing. But otherwise, their customers are banks, are credit unions, right? And what they do is they lower the cost of lending for credit unions and banks. So, the way it is funded in North Dakota by law. So why North Dakota? How did this happen there? First of all, I should say public banking is quite common around the world. It's somewhat rare in the United States, but very common internationally. In North Dakota, there was a group called the Nonpartisan League, which was essentially, if you want to think of it this way, the Bernie Sanders type characters of their time. So back in the 1910s, the heartbed of socialism in the United States was not New York City, was not Denver, but was, you got it,
North Dakota.
And they won a majority in the state legislature, and they won the governorship. And they passed a law to create a publicly owned granary, and they also passed a law to create a publicly owned bank, and that's why they have it. So the bank, when the state of North Dakota collects tax dollars, income tax or sales tax or whatever it is, where does that money get deposited? Not in Wells Fargo, not in Citibank, not in Bank of America, but the Bank of North Dakota. That provides the capital for the bank to then lend out. So they have a low cost source of financing from state tax dollars. They then reinvest, they have a mission to reinvest that money within North Dakota. And it makes a difference in terms of things like housing. Hard to get a loan to buy or sell a house when there's not a lot of comparables in a rural town in North Dakota. So guess what? The state of North Dakota takes that loan off of the local credit union or bank's balance sheet. It buys up the loan and therefore allows that sale to go through. So that's why a public bank is important. Also, as I'm sure folks understand, we have a fractional reserve banking system in the United States. So if you have $100 on deposit as a bank or a credit union, you can lend out some multiple of that. Let's say it's 10x. I'm not sure that's exactly correct. Mm-hmm. But you could lend out 1,000 off of that 100 in capital. So this provides a low-cost source of financing for housing, but also business development and local economic development generally. And today, you're starting to see campaigns that have actually been, there was actually a law passed in California a few years back that allows for localities or regions to create public banks of their own. So there won't likely be a Bank of California, but there might be a Bank of San Francisco, Bank of Los Angeles, et cetera. There's efforts to develop those. And then there are campaigns similarly in New York State, Ohio, New Mexico, and other states across the country to sort of imitate this model and use it to leverage public funds for public benefit.
Like I said, I like learning from you. I knew nothing about this public bank. Okay. It sounds like they take on a role of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and in a secondary market for mortgages. Also.
In their housing, yeah, essentially they are, and of course, as you may know, Bank of North Dakota was founded in 1919, so that's 15 years before Fannie Mae was founded, right? Mm. I think Fannie Mae was created in 1934.
Oh boy! And so another theme in your work is collaboration. Why is it so important, particularly for cooperatives, labor unions, tenant organizations, community development groups, nonprofits to work together instead of operating separate silos?
Yeah, because I mean the simplest answer, it goes back to the Roman Empire. Divide and conquer was the phrase. I won't try to say it in Latin. So the way that, how do we get to a situation where 20 people own 12% of the value of the entire U.S. economy? Okay, it didn't happen because labor unions, tenant organizations, nonprofits, cooperatives, and community development groups are all working together. It happened because they could be played off against each other, and so this is actually imperative to use community-based organizations to build alliances in order to build power to recalibrate the economy to serve ordinary people as opposed to folks at the very top. That's the simplest and most basic answer I can give to that question.
Okay. But collaboration is at the root of cooperation, working together, and it's at the root of everything else you're talking about. Okay.
It is, but I sometimes joke about it. Like there's principle 6 of cooperatives is cooperation among cooperatives, as you know. Mm-hmm. And I sometimes say that would be a good idea.
If it worked?
Meaning if people actually abided by the principles, but in fact, often folks are more short-sighted, and one can understand why when folks are in disparate economic conditions or conditions that at least seem desperate. Sometimes they really are. Sometimes maybe they just seem desperate, but what have you. The tendency to focus on the short term and not the long term is common and powerful, unfortunately. And so that's a tendency that needs to be resisted and overcome.
So you are working with Shelterforce now, and for more than 50 years, they've been reporting on affordable housing and community development. Why is independent journalism so important to creating better public policy?
Yeah, Well, thanks for the shout out to Shelterforce. I'll start with that. It really is. I am very excited to have joined them earlier this year. And I blogged for them back in the day when I was still working at the Democracy Club. So I've known Shelterforce for a long time. Independent journalism, and I think independence is kind of a complicated word. I don't know if I want to use that word, but what I will say is reporting, journalism, media provides critical institutional infrastructure to help make. We were talking about collaboration and how that often doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. If you can create a more common understanding of the challenges that are being faced, you create the basis for effective collaboration. So there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation being where people are intentionally trying to deceive in the public realm. And so having trusted sources that can build common understanding, which can help create those coalitions that shift power to ordinary people, is really important. And that's also critical to creating better public policy, because public policy isn't just better in the abstract. It's better if it helps people, for example, stay in their homes. So a really simple thing is a right to counsel if there's a threat of eviction. Eviction has horrible effects on people's lives. Not just the fact that they have to move, but it makes it harder to move in somewhere else, makes it harder to get employment, really harms people's life chances going forward. And having the ability to access public representation, which some cities are now putting into law, is a public policy that evens the scales. It doesn't mean you can just not pay your rent and continue to live there, but it means that has to be demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt. There has to be current circumstances have to be evaluated, like, did the landlord maintain the responsibilities in terms of maintaining the property, et cetera. And without that, people who don't have resources just leave, even when they have a stellar case that would keep them in their homes. They might, and that makes people's lives worse off. So public policy depends on understanding what the issues are, and then building political coalitions to actually implement policies that help ordinary people live better lives. So that's why it's important.
Getting the common knowledge out there that's not deceitful.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of obfuscation that goes on, and power usually operates in the shadows, behind the scenes.
And I think that word independent was about, at least my intention was, independent from government, that there's a voice out there.
Yes, okay. Definitely independent from government. But I mean, we strive to be independent. I don't want to say we're not. We have a board, we're a nonprofit, et cetera. But I do think everybody is connected to something. Like Shelterforce was formed by tenant organizers in 1975. So that's not a neutral perspective on housing, right? It's a pro-tenant perspective. We don't shy away from that. We're fair. We don't just pretend like I don't know, all tenants are saints or something like that. Mm. That's not true. But we do have a point of view about what a just housing market and just housing in general for a society looks like. And so, yes, we're independent, but as I said, everybody has a position. I think the idea, this may be controversial, but I think the idea of a objective, truly quote unquote objective journalism is kind of a myth. All journalism has some position. The point is to be honest about your position and to be fair in your reporting and accurate.
Mm-hmm. So you've been covering houses across the country which gives you a unique perspective. What communities or innovations are giving you the greatest optimism today?
Well, this followed from what I just said a little bit. It's not so much the innovations. I mean, okay, there are cooperatives, or I could name like uh, different types of community trusts, and there are innovations, and some of them are real, and some of them are important. But I think fundamentally, what gives me the most optimism is that tenant unions, which are not a new idea, in fact, as I said, Shelterforce was founded in 1975 by tenant union activists. So they've been around for decades and decades, but they've come back, in the 2020s in a real powerful way. And so tenant organizing and housing justice organizing has really taken off in the last few years across the country, including, there's a group called, I'm probably going to mangle it, but it's like Stamp Out or Stump Out slumlords in Washington, D.C., for example. There are these tenant unions that have, and organizing groups that have really become much more prominent nationally and are allowing for more resident-focused housing policy that can make for more affordable housing for residents in communities. So, has tenant organizing ended mass evictions and stuff across the country? No, not everywhere. But it's making a difference in a lot of different communities, including Washington, D.C., and I find that hopeful. I find it hopeful that you're starting to see social housing policies getting passed into law in popular referendums, as has happened in Seattle, as has happened in Los Angeles. There are currently efforts in other cities, such as Portland, Oregon, underway. So people who have been sort of pressed down by increasingly unaffordable housing markets, increasingly corporatized land ownership patterns. If you think about the role of private equity as owner of more and more single family homes, et cetera, you're starting to see a political response, you're starting to see a community response, and it starts with organizing at the local level, and I find that very inspiring. I'll shout out to the Tenant Union Federation, for example. Tenant Union Federation didn't even exist 5 years ago. It started by folks in Kansas City. It's now national. Democratic Socialists of America have also done a lot of housing organizing and have had powerful impacts. So, I see that. I see the fact that people are waking up and organizing for their own benefit as being the thing that gives me the greatest optimism at the current moment.
Fantastic. So you've edited books, you've written articles, led organizations, and helped shape a national conversation about economic justice. Looking back, what accomplishments are you most proud of?
Well, I'll mention there are many things that I'm of in terms of my work. I feel like whether it was at Democracy Collaborative or Nonprofit Quarterly or now at Shelterforce, that my work has helped elevate a lot of community voices and give them a national platform that they wouldn't otherwise have. One thing I will mention is a book that I co-edited with Raymond Foxworth called Invisible No More, Voices from Native America. This was based on article series that we developed over a few years while I was at Nonprofit Quarterly and while Ray was at First Nations Development Institute. And it provided really the first opportunity. There's a lot of books on Native history, Native stories. There's not a lot on Native Indigenous-led community development and how what's actually being done in Native communities, how they are reacting to the world of philanthropy, which can be a source of funding, but also a source of control that often has to be negotiated. So that's one specific contribution that I'm very proud of, and I was glad I was able to work, with so many amazing Native leaders. If I start naming them, I will leave people off, so I won't. But it really, I'm always inspired by the people I work with, and I at some level, I write a lot, but I'm most energized by the folks I edit because I hear their voices and they have so much wisdom and knowledge to share, and I'm happy to be a part of lifting those voices into the public sphere.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading that book, Invisible No More, Voices from Native America. Yeah, that sounds great. But if a young person came to you today wanting to devote their career to strengthening communities, what advice would you give them?
That's a hard question to really answer succinctly. I will say it's certainly worth getting involved with a community organization, and that might mean volunteering. And often you don't necessarily need to have a degree in urban planning or something like that. You have the skills you have can be applied to strengthening communities. So do what you love, and then be connected with people you care about to apply those skills in a productive manner. I guess that's the best succinct advice I can give.
Okay. Are there any community organizations that you think are good for a young person to get started in?
Yes. I think there's a lot of different, it's useful to start where, I always say organize where you are.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in a faith community, organize within your synagogue or mosque or church. If you are, in a neighborhood association, organize through your neighborhood association. So there are community development corporations, community development financial institutions.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so very much. We've run out of time. I have more questions, but we've run out of time. And I would like to get you on again, maybe in the next 6 months or so. And everybody out there, live cooperatively. We'll see you next week.